any question on any aspect of the Christian faith.
Is there a relationship between Mithra and Jesus?
No. This is a common myth that has been popularized by a popular YouTube video called the Zeitgeist around 15 to 20 years ago. It has no support in academia. No academics support this idea. Dr. Mike Lacona and Dr. West Huff have both done studies on these kinds of parallels, and by reading the very materials that are often said, oh, they borrowed from these materials, like the Gilgamesh myth, have found that there's no correlation. The correlations are sparse, sporadic,
Can you
and
name the correlation?
so one example, and by the way, I'm taking questions from multiple people. If you want to debate, you have to stand in front of the camera.
Okay, all right.
All right, come in. Right.
All right, okay. So, can you list any of the correlations?
Yeah. So, for example, some of the people try to say that in these ancient tales, you have the hero dying and then rising to new life. Oh, that sounds like Jesus. But if you actually study these stories, like the story of Gilgamesh, which I'm more familiar with, what actually happens is Gilgamesh remains alive and he descends into Hades, the place of the dead. He never actually dies. And then he comes back out with the person that he's rescuing. He never dies. And so the correlation is a mythical one. It's a construct. Christianity is not rooted in any Iron Age or Greek myth. Christianity is rooted in Judaism. I'll give you another example. They'll often say, oh, Christians believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and that Romans and Greeks believed that Achilles and Hercules were the sons of Zeus. But if you look at those myths, Zeus comes down as a swan and rapes a woman. And that's how his children is born. Such a thing doesn't exist in Christianity. And that the Son didn't exist prior to the conception. Christianity believes, by contrast, that the eternal Word of God that we see in the Old Testament incarnates as Jesus Christ. So, again, the correlation is spurious.
Okay, well, the thing is that it's not. There are some academics who do believe, and if you read Herodotus, I'm sure you've heard of Herodotus, the father of history. Herodotus describes Syria, and he describes the religion of Syria, and he says that they worship Dionysus. And then when we do the archaeology, by Dionysus he means Mithra. Mithra is the similarities between Mithra and Jesus are there's multiple similarities, and we know that the religion of Mithra spread across the whole of Europe and was the most popular religion around the time that Christ is supposed to have been born, and that and also in Herodotus he does refer to Christos. Christos is being referred to, and the cross was was one of the symbols of the Phoenicians. They're also in the same. They're all in Syria. All of these people are in Syria. And finally, the final point is that you're talking about it being linked to Judaism. There's even more problems with that. 1,000 more problems as soon as you say that, because the documentary evidence for the existence of the Old Testament prior to 180 BC does not exist. So when Alexander conquered the entire empire that he conquered what we call Israel, or whatever you want to call it, Palestine, Israel. He conquered the whole of Egypt, he conquered the whole of Syria, and what he found was no Jews, and he found no Christians, but he did find a lot of people worshipping what the Greeks called Dionysus, and what the Syrians called Christos or Mithra. And Mithra is very, very similar to Jesus, and it's the most popular religion in the region. And there is a conflict. Final point. There is a conflict between the Egyptian-based Alexandrian Ptolemaic religion, which I think we can kind of call the Judaic, the Pharisee religion, and the religion of Syria, which is the kind of Christian religion. They two are in conflict with each other. They don't agree about things like circumcision. So the Syrians are saying, stop the circumcision, and the Egyptians are saying, no, we are going to continue circumcision.
Can I reply?
Yeah.
Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to suggest to you that what you just heard was a load of poppycock. Here's why. Right? I have Herodotus's book at home. I have read Herodotus's book. I have not found, maybe I've forgotten, maybe you can find the references, but I've not found any of the things that he said was in the book. So I would like him now to quote for us, so I can go back and check in my own copy of Herodotus. I would like the references to what he just said, so I can note them down and reference them in the actual book that I possess. I am curious if you can actually do that. Secondly, the idea that Alexander did not find Jews, it's a complete myth. We know this is poppycock because the successor to Alexander's empire was fought by the Jewish family of the Maccabees. That's what you find if you read the book Maccabees 1, Maccabees 2, Maccabees 3. The successors to Alexander the Great fought a war against rebelling Jews that we have the historical books for, called the books of Maccabees, ladies and gentlemen. Now, if this group had just emerged after Alexander, they would not have been so strong and coordinated to have successfully rebelled. But they did, having overthrown the rule of the Greeks. Furthermore, we have archaeological discoveries that predate the Alexandrian Empire that you can find in the British Museum. Xerxes of the Persians, who Alexander destroyed, references the Jews in his official documents that you can find in the British Museum. Sorry, I'm talking now. I let you talk. So this idea that Alexander conquered the whole world and he didn't find any Jews is a total poppycock lie, ladies and gentlemen. And we have hard evidence to demonstrate its falsity. If you don't believe me, go and speak to a Persian. They're very proud of Xerxes. Furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we have archaeological discoveries referencing King David, who is before Alexander the Great. We have archaeological discoveries referencing Yahweh before Alexander the Great. We know that the Temple Mount was built upon as a temple before Alexander the Great. This kind of poppycock comes from YouTube, Google searches and YouTube videos. It doesn't come from academic study. If you want real academic study, go and look up Dr. Mike Lacona on this topic. Go and look Dr. Wes Huff on this topic.
Okay, so in response, you've made a number of claims. One is quite dramatic, that there is no academic or archaeological evidence. I would argue, on the contrary, that there is overwhelming and conclusive archaeological and academic reference. I would argue that the so-called Bible itself, the 5 books, is itself quite an important piece of evidence, because that does kind of line up with this a bit. I will just mention Alexander and Herodotus because you brought these two up. In terms of Herodotus, just do a search on Dionysus. You will find lots of references to Dionysus, and you will find the references to Dionysus being the god of the Syrians. And in Syria, there is a guy who ends up ruling the whole region, and his name is actually Mithridates. I'm sure you've heard of Mithridates, very famous figure in history. And now going back to Alexander and his conquest, well, he founded a city in Egypt, and that city was called Alexandria. And the city of Alexandria is very famous because Cleopatra was based in this city, and Antony and Caesar were in this city. Caesar's power was based on bank loans from this city. So he was in conflict with this city, and he actually attacked the city because he defaulted on his bank loans. A lot of people aren't aware of that. But going back to whether this is a myth. The people, Jews or not, this is widely debated in the classical era. I'm sure you've heard of Plutarch. I'm sure you've heard of Tacitus. Look those sources up. Tacitus and Plutarch, the two most famous Latin and Greek historians, they themselves say that it is a myth. There is no such people as the Jews as far as Alexander the Great was concerned. And let me just coming to the decisive point. In the city of Alexandria in Egypt, there was a family called the Alexander family. Now, whether that's really the same family as Alexander the Great, we don't know. But we do know that Alexander the Great followed a religion. His son was called Alexander the Fourth. He followed a religion, and that religion was called Zeus Sabazius. Zeus Sabazius, remember that, and look it up online. You will even find Wikipedia references to Zeus Sabazius. Now that sounds very similar to Zeus Sabbath.
Can I reply?
And I'm sure you've heard of Zeus Sabbath because the Jews in Rome were called the worshippers of Zeus Sabbath.
Can I reply?
And yes, you will, but just let me finish the point. I'm coming to the conclusion. And finally, in Iraq itself, and we all know that the legendary Jews were expelled to Iraq, and then they created the Babylonian Talmud, and this is what they still worship today as their most sacred text. We know that Zeus Sabazius, or the Sabbath, that term is also archaeologically found and referred to in Iraq itself.
Can I reply?
So I'm coming to the conclusion with Alexandria. This Alexander family exists in Alexandria. If you go even onto Wikipedia, it acknowledges without any dispute. Go to the section on the Old Testament or Tanakh or whichever term you prefer to use. It does say that there's different documentary hypotheses on where it came from. No one knows to this day where the Old Testament came from. But the most popular theory is a bunch of people were hired by the Ptolemies and they wrote the Old Testament between approximately 220 BC and 180 BC.
Can I reply?
It then appeared in 108. Let me finish.
But you're not finishing.
I'm finishing. I promise I'm finishing. It appeared in 180 BC, and then it spread across the entire classical world, and it was the most famous book in the classical world after 180
Can I
BC.
reply now?
Final point is on Alexandria.
Just
Very last point.
You just made a final point.
Very last point.
Make it your last point.
In Alexandria.
Because I'm not. Wait.
In the
I want to
time.
be clear. I'm not giving up the space for you to give a sermon.
Okay.
You need to finish.
I'm finishing.
No, you need to finish on this point.
I'm finishing
You go
on
on
this
to make another point. I'm going to
Alexandria.
interrupt you.
Alexandria. So in the city of Alexandria, in the 3rd century BC, they say there's only two people living there. Greeks, Phoenicians. However, Josephus, who is the guy who you would be referring to, and you believe it's all true, that's Josephus, he argues that, and he's the famous guy for arguing that. There's a Manetho guy in Alexandria who wrote a famous book saying, no, there's no such people. He wrote a history of Egypt. They don't exist. It's the Hyksos that are actually being referred to. Josephus refers to only two groups living in Alexandria when he is alive, and he's alive around the time of Jesus. So he would have known Jesus because he was in Jerusalem when Jesus is supposed to have lived. And he's the only independent source that claims that Jesus existed, by the way, is Josephus. He's the only source.
Can
there
I
are
reply?
No other sources.
Right.
He says there's only
You're not
two.
finishing.
This is the
You're
last
not
point.
finishing.
I am finishing.
You need to finish.
I am finishing.
Right. You need to finish because I have not given up my Q&A for you to give a sermon.
Okay.
So you're going to stop now. I'm going to reply.
So the last point.
No. You've made your last point. You've made your last point. You've made your last point.
Go on.
Guys, ladies and gentlemen, right? To be clear, I've not given up my space for a Q&A so he can give you all a sermon, right? And just stringing together a series of incoherent points is not an argument. But unfortunately, that's what you've just received. You've received word salad, right? Let's get a couple of things factually correct. Firstly, Josephus was a Jew, and he tried to say that the Josephus didn't mention the Jews. Josephus took part in the Jewish rebellion against the Romans in 70 AD. He was captured by Vespasian, and he wrote an apology in terms of the histories to defend the Jews. He cites the existence of Jesus, as does Tacitus, as does Plutarch, as does Suetonius. These are the people, and he's saying that only, I think it was Tacitus, mentions Jesus. The fact of the matter is, ladies and gentlemen, these kinds of arguments are coming from ignorance, and they are relying upon your ignorance. Plutarch wrote the lives of the Caesars. Ladies and gentlemen, it is undeniable that the Jews existed in the first century. Undeniable that they existed in the first century. And it is undeniable that they existed centuries before. Here's why. Because Pharaoh on the pyramids or on a tablet says that I have laid waste Jerusalem. He's talking about the Jews. And this is before, ladies and gentlemen, Alexander the Great. So this argument that this brother is trying to make is based out of complete ignorance. The archaeological evidence, the documentary evidence to the existence of the Jews is undeniable. He's trying to say that it was made up, maybe in the Babylonian Talmud? I'm not quite sure where during the Babylonian captivity. Is that where you're trying to say it was? The Babylonian captivity predates Alexander the Great. That's where the Samaritans come from. So what you're hearing here is a litany of ignorance. Jesus Christ is a Jewish figure, the existence of which is undeniable to every serious historian. Nobody denies that Jesus existed. No serious historian denies that he was crucified, ladies and gentlemen. And if he was crucified, Islam is false. If he was crucified, this narrative is false. Because the reason why Christians adopted the cross was because of the crucifixion. It wasn't because of some Phoenician Mithra symbol. And please note, he hasn't given the quotes for Herodotus, which I've asked him to produce. He's asserted Herodotus said things, but he hasn't proven it. And I have a copy of Herodotus' book at home in my own personal collection. I've read the book, and nothing of what he said sounds familiar to what I read. So either I've forgotten, or he's speaking in ignorance, or he is lying, ladies and gentlemen. So I want to ask him again, produce the quotes from Herodotus to your claims. Now, he mentioned Dionysus, and this is what I mean. He's just chucking random things at people in an incoherent way. Let me tell you about Dionysus. Dionysus was the Greek god of chaos and fun and partying. He is the god of sex and passion and alcohol and partying and basically just being liberal on a Friday night. That's the religion of Dionysus. Mithra was an entirely different religion. And he's confusing the two of them. But Dionysus never did anything that looks like what we say about Jesus, so I don't even know why he's bringing him up. But then he says, well, Mithra did it. What exactly did Mithra do that is like Jesus? Let's actually hear what it is. He also pointed out, if you don't want me to go on, you don't need to make so many points. How about we restrict it? Do you want to do it timed? Yeah? He also said that there's no evidence of the Bible. Utter rubbish before maybe 200 years before Jesus. Now, let's be clear. The manuscripts upon which the scriptures were written over 2,000 years ago was papyrus. Papyrus is tree leaves. What does organic material do? It rots and decays. we would not expect to see documents in papyri from so long ago. That's not normal. These things decay and die. So of course there is a cut-off point historically at which the physical evidence of the scriptures disappear. But, ladies and gentlemen, the physical practice of Judaism is found in stone. It's found in archaeology in Jerusalem. And that archaeology matches up to what we read in the Old Testament. And that means that even though the paper material might not be there, evidence of its existence is found in stone. And this is what ignorance looks like. Now, I don't know where it's coming from or why it's there, but I just want to warn you that these statements are a soup salad of words, incoherent and unconnected ideas. They're just being chucked at you. It sounds like conspiracy theory madness. So everybody get out your tinfoil hats and let's await the Martian invasion.
Okay.
Right, can we maybe limit it to 3 points?
Okay.
Or time it, can we time it to 3 minutes each?
Okay, 3 minutes.
Wait, let time get set.
Okay, so the first point, you made a number of points.
Wait. I'm debating this guy now, bro. Not taking questions. Right, 3 minutes.
Okay, so the first thing is I think it's very important to stay polite because our frame of mind is then more acceptable to learning and listening when it's all very polite. And I'm not insulting you. I hope you're not going to insult me or anybody that wants to know the truth. So in terms of finding out the truth, just to finish the point about Alexandria, Alexandria is a city that you need to look up because a lot of the classical writers said the Alexander family of the city of Alexandria in Egypt were the people that were responsible for producing, paying for, and writing the Old Testament in conjunction with the Ptolemy family. The Ptolemy family, they are the rulers of Egypt. They are the successors to Alexander the Great. Josephus refers to the city of Alexandria in his time, that's 70 AD as you correctly mentioned. He's the only source, not Tacitus, Josephus, who says that a person called Jesus did live. He says that in the city of Alexandria in his time, 70 AD, not 300 BC, there are only 2 groups of people living there then. Greeks and not Phoenicians. Phoenicians don't exist anymore. Nobody's heard of Phoenicians in 70 AD. The people that he refers to existing in Alexandria then are Greeks and Jews. Half of the population of Alexandria is Greek, the other half is Jews. Whereas if you go back to Alexander's historians, and he has a number of them, they refer to, Arian is the most famous one, he refers to Alexandria being lived in by Greeks and Phoenicians. And what has clearly happened is that the Phoenicians have become the Jews. That's what's happened. It's obvious. Where are the Phoenicians based in? Syria. So there's your Syrian connection. We've talked about Mithridates as well. We can talk about the god Baal. Why are they all linked to this myth of Jews and so on? Because the Persians, as you correctly stated, conquered the entire Middle East. The most famous city that you want to look up is actually Petra. In this city, this was a center of religion going way back to 2000 BC. In that city, they got rid of their idol worshipping.
It's all right. It's all right.
And they replaced the
idols. I'll get him.
They replaced the idols with stones, and they began to worship stones. And the inscriptions in the city of Petra, this is also in Jordan, very close to Syria, states that's because they had converted to monotheism because the Zoroastrians were monotheistic. And they encouraged all of their conquered populations to become monotheistic. So in Yemen, they worship the god Baal, who is the origins of Allah. And in the Egypt, they worshipped, obviously, Yahweh, who is actually linked to Shiva. It's the same word with 2 consonantal shifts. And obviously in Syria, they worship Mithra, and the Greeks called Mithra Dionysus. Finished.
Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the writing of the Old Testament in Egypt. There was a production of the Old Testament in Egypt. It's called the Septuagint. the Septuagint was a translation, which means that, obviously, the thing that you're translating exists before your translation. The Septuagint was in Greek. That means they were translating from an earlier document in Hebrew. This is not, ladies and gentlemen, the invention of the Old Testament. And he hasn't addressed the point that I raised, that physical archaeology corresponds to the narrative of the Old Testament Bible. Don't believe me, think I'm lying, then I invite you all to go on a Bible tour at the British Museum, where a happy, healthy, nice and friendly Christian will walk you all around the British Museum, showing you stone artifact after artifact after artifact that corresponds with the Old Testament. Now, he has repeated the same mistake again, that Jesus is only referred to, was it Tacitus you said?
Josephus.
By Josephus. Now let me prove him wrong. Right? This is what Tacitus said. He said only Jesus refers to Jesus. Josephus refers to Jesus. This is Tacitus. Nero fastened the guilt on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate, and the most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of evil, but not even in Rome. So that's a reference by Tacitus to Jesus. Let's go on. Pliny the Younger. They were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light. Then they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God. That's a reference. And bound themselves by a solemn oath not to do any wicked deeds, but never commit adultery or fraud. Let me give you another one. We know that Josephus mentions it, that's not in dispute. In the Babylonian Talmud it says, on the eve of the Passover, Yeshu was hanged for 40 days before the execution took place. So there you go, references apart from Tacitus. Go on.
Okay, so just one final point on that. That if you look at Herodotus, so coming back to that book, by the way, this was written in 500 BC, 500 years before Jesus is supposed to have been born. And he does refer, you can look it up, Dionysus, number one thing to look up after this. The second thing you can look up is Christos. So Herodotus refers to those that worship Christos over and over again. So many times when I listen to it, you can get it on Audible and listen to it. I highly recommend it. I was shocked how many times he was referring to Christos. Herodotus wrote in 500 BC. 500 years before Jesus is born, they are worshipping Christos in Syria. How do you explain that? I cannot explain that. I'm just trying to find answers. I'm just trying to find out the truth. But you've been very polite. I really appreciate your time. And it's been a very interesting thing. But my daughter wants to go for a walk. So thank you very much for your time.
Right, I'm going to take your 2 minutes and add it to mine.
Okay, go.
So I've now got 5 minutes.
Okay.
Right, so notice, he didn't notice the moment I got him out on telling you a lie that only Josephus referred to Jesus, suddenly it's time to go for a walk. But it's not just Tacitus and Josephus and the Babylonian Talmud, it's also Lucian. Lucian says that Christians worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. Who do Christians worship that was crucified?
Jesus.
So Lucian references Jesus. So clearly he was factually wrong on that point. He was factually wrong when he said that Alexander went across the entire world and never found the Jews. Bearing in mind that at the British Museum you can find artifacts from Persia that predate Alexander the Great that explicitly reference the Jews. Or in Egypt, you can find artifacts that explicitly reference the Jews. Or the books of Maccabees that talk about the Jewish rebellion against the Greek empires that were the direct successors of the Alexandrian Empire. But he didn't address these points. Notice also, once again, he cited Herodotus. He said he's listened to it many times. But when I asked him to provide a single reference, because I have Herodotus's book in my house, he has not once produced a quote to back up what he says. Now, for the sake of argument, let's pretend that Herodotus does reference Christus. Yeah, no, I haven't. I'm using your 2 minutes that you gave up. Now I'm using my 3 minutes. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's pretend Herodotus. Let's pretend you gave up your time. No one forced you to. Let's pretend.
Thanks very much.
Okay, he's going to walk away. Yeah. That's all right. Wait, brother, before you go. Brother, before you go, I'd like to give you a gift, just to show there's no hard feelings. I'll come back and finish my point. I'd like to give you a gift. What's your name?
Bill.
Bill. And what's your own religion, Bill? What's your own religion?
I prefer not to say.
Right. Remember that one of my arguments is about the temple predating the Old Testament and predating the Alexandrian Empire. So this is a book about the temple for you.
That's great. Thanks a lot.
Have a good day. God bless.